Welcome back to Can You Hear Me, a podcast about hearing, hearing loss, and everything in between. I'm here today with Dr. Katie Berg, assistant professor of otolaryngology at WashU, whose research interests are focused on improving music perception for patients with cochlear implants. I don't want to give you any more information before I let our guest talk, so Dr. Berg, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Rishi. It's a pleasure to be on.
Of course, and I'm also excited to have you on, so let's just jump straight into it. My first question for you is about what drew you into studying cochlear implants and music perception specifically, because I haven't seen really a lot of people in the cochlear implant space who focus on music perception. Usually it's speech perception. So I'm just wondering, why are you interested in this, and what have your past experiences been like for you to even want to pursue this as a career?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I had a really non-traditional path to audiology. In fact, when I got to college, I didn't know what audiology was. It wasn't on my radar. I was at St. Olaf College. It's a small liberal arts school in Minnesota, and it's known for music. And so I was there as a violin performance major. I thought I was going to audition for orchestras and just be an orchestral violinist. But at St. Olaf, being a liberal arts school, they make you take certain requirements in other disciplines outside of music. And one of those, of course, is science. And so my friends and I, about halfway through sophomore year, needed a required science credit. And so obviously our key criteria were short and easy. And so we had a January term, so it was a 4-week class, and we saw this class called Psychology of Hearing. And we thought, well, that sounds pretty easy. We'll just knock it out with that. Well, spoiler, it was not actually an easy class, but it did lead me to meeting an elementary school music teacher. And she told a story about how she woke up one day, suddenly lost her hearing in one ear. No prior history of hearing loss, just all of a sudden woke up and could no longer hear out of her ear. And she told us sort of her journey to meeting with an audiologist, talking about implications of hearing loss, treatment options, and then eventually she went on to get a cochlear implant, and then was talking to us about her experience. And she said, speech sounds pretty good through the implant. I can understand what people are saying, but music just sounds awful. And I was so fascinated by that. Like, how could speech be good and then music sound awful? And she was saying how it's really difficult for her to hear her kids in her class. And so she was really struggling with getting back to playing music. And so I thought maybe there was a space here where I could use my background in music to potentially help people in a way I hadn't thought about before. So fast forward, her story really stuck with me. I ended up joining the lab of the professor who taught that class. His name is Dr. Jeremy Lobach, and he really introduced me to cochlear implants, and kind of the rest is history.
Wow, that's pretty cool. I mean, I've heard of people who have, started undergrad with wildly different things than audiology or, otolaryngology in mind, but I think this is the furthest one I've heard so far, because you wanted to go into violin performance.
Yep.
Because everyone else has been trying to go into at least STEM. So, but this is pretty cool because you are still at kind of with music performance. It is something that is still in your research today, I assume, maybe in a very, very small part. But that's kind of interesting you mentioned that story about the elementary school teacher, because it really does show that today cochlear implants are very much suited for speech perception and not so much music perception. So why do you think that is? Why are cochlear implants so much better for one over the other? And is it something to do with the mechanics, and like what makes the research even necessary in the first place?
Yeah, that's a great question. When cochlear implants were first developed, right, our goal was to restore some sort of sound awareness. So the first recipients of cochlear implants, and I'm talking about like the first FDA approved devices in the 80s, were really profoundly deaf in both ears. And the goal was just to hear sound awareness. The goal was not even to understand speech per se, but that was the ultimate goal. And so music, I like to think of as sort of like this higher level of hearing. So you have to be able to understand speech to hear music, because of the fine pitch perception, that fine spectral information that you get with music, that you don't necessarily need for speech. So our goal was just, let's start small and work our way towards music, but it really wasn't on people's radars for the longest time. I would say like the last 40 years. And that's why you see like most of research on cochlear implants is focused on speech. And that's because like if we can't get speech right, then there's no hope for music. And so I think we're just now at a place where cochlear implant technology is ready to have these discussions and these projects focused on music. I wouldn't say we're perfect at speech, but we've made a lot of bounds in terms of the signal processing or how the device handles the sound and converts it to an electrical signal and then delivers it for our brain to interpret. So I think there's still room to grow in speech, and I'm not an advocate of saying, oh, we don't need to worry about speech anymore, because we definitely do. But I think we're finally at a place, an exciting place, where we can start to think about how we might improve music as well. So I'm really excited about where we're going as a field, because I think as we get more advances in the technology, we'll be able to really work on music and make it sound as good as we can.
Yeah, I mean that's pretty cool. I haven't thought of it before as, speech perception is easier than music perception, but I can see now, because I guess speech is not as complex as music. Speech is definitely complex, but not to the same degree as music, with all of its, like very, very small intricacies and all of that stuff. So you've now, in your answer, you talked about the past of, cochlear implant research. What have people been focusing on in the past? But I'm interested in hearing what you think the future of cochlear implants look like. What do you see for this field in 10 or 20 years or so? And, not just relating to music perception, but cochlear implants as a whole. I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say broadly, we as a field have traditionally treated each cochlear implant patient relatively the same. And we know humans are not at all the same. We might have similarities. We might have similar hearing histories, or you could group people by age. But it turns out when we put all the usual predictors into these models to try and predict these cochlear implant outcomes, we can only come up with explaining about 20% of the variance in outcomes. So a relatively small amount. And we're left with all this variance left sort of, we don't know why some people do well and some people don't. And so I think as a field, we're all moving towards being able to personalize both like the treatment of a cochlear implant. So like what type of cochlear implant might someone benefit most from? Some surgical factors, like are there certain surgical techniques that are better for certain people? Are there, certain programming things that the audiologist can do once they have the implant to make that person's more successful in their outcome? And then I think another outcome is just thinking beyond speech, like we've kind of touched on, being our main outcome, and thinking about things like music perception. Another thing I've recently become really fascinated by is sound quality perception, and the variability there. And then overall quality of life, because I think all of us are in the business of trying to improve people's quality of life. And so I want to make sure that what we're doing is towards that goal. So there's lots of areas of improvement, but I think the overarching goal is to really personalize how we treat each person coming to us who might be a cochlear implant candidate, and then what we do to help that person after they get one too. So personalizing is going to be really key in a lot of these areas.
Yeah, definitely. I really agree with you when you say that the future of this field is really built on a higher understanding of the variability in cochlear implant outcomes. Because as you said, right now, we really don't understand why some patients with similar hearing histories will do wildly different with a cochlear implant. And it kind of leads me into what I wanted to ask you next, which is just getting into the specifics of your research. I saw that you had one study on the impact of marital status on cochlear implant outcomes. So it's very interesting that you have done research like that, because I usually see when people are looking at cochlear implant outcomes, like you said, it's usually something like age and duration of deafness or residual hearing or etiology, why are they deaf? But it's kind of cool to see a different side of the like completely different angle. So, can you tell me more about this study and, why you guys even did it?
Yeah, this one was a fun one. I have to give all the credit to Barak Spector. He is a fantastic med student at Tel Aviv University, and we were lucky enough to work with him for a year when he came to the lab at Vanderbilt. And he was really trying to delve into some of these questions about, like, are there other predictors of outcomes that we just maybe haven't thought about before? And I would say this paper was in the context of the lab we were both working in at the time, that's really focused on cognitive outcomes, but also more like social context outcomes. So the marriage piece, we're not necessarily saying like, oh, if marriage is a predictor, everybody go run out and get married. If you're not already, or if you don't have a spouse, oh, that's too bad. You're never going to do well with your implant. That's not what we're saying at all. But it was in this larger context of how do people's social networks, or lack thereof, right? Like if you're a person who spends 98% of the day all by themselves, doesn't talk to anybody, how does that impact your outcome versus someone who maybe is very well integrated into their community, maybe is talking to all different kinds of people all the time. Maybe they have a job where they're on Zoom calls all day long and they have to be able to communicate over the phone. And so we have strong reasons to think that these types of things impact outcomes quite a bit. And so that's sort of the context of this paper that Barak really explored this question of marriage as a predictor. Another thing I'll point out is with this study, we looked at about 600 cochlear implant users who are adults. And that's a pretty large sample size, but I will say we focused on marriage because it's something that you can easily extract from the medical record. So one thing I'll say is it didn't include people who, maybe had like long-term partners outside of a marriage. So I'll say that with a little caveat there. But what's fascinating is it ended up being a predictor of outcomes, which I think makes a lot of sense intuitively, right? Like if you are married to someone, presumably you're spending a lot of time with that person. That person cares about your well-being and wants you to do well with the device. So they might be encouraging you to wear your device, to maybe follow up more, to maybe do some of the auditory training that the audiologist is recommending. They might be a conversation partner for that person. And so I think this study, while it was totally new and fun to explore, makes a lot of intuitive sense that if you have a partner that can help you get used to this, signal from the implant, you're going to do better. And that's what we found in the study.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I get what you mean, obviously, when you say it's not the fact that they're married that's improving their outcomes, but it's all of these associated stuff. And I really think that shows how important all of the, again, associated stuff is for cochlear implant outcomes. It's not just the implant itself, but it's, how much are you using this implant? How long are you wearing it for? Are you going in for your follow-ups? Are you completing auditory therapy? So all of these things. So it's really important that there's a study like this out there that's showing this, and that future researchers can build on this. And I think this is a great place for us to close off today. Thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Berg. I mean, it's been great having you on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. And good luck with your podcast. I'm excited to see who you interview next.
Of course. Thank you.